also. Okay.
Good. Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Just before I pass to Luiz, he's going to present it. Um, it's a talk, but if he said, feel free to ask questions if you have in the middle. Don't it's going to be more like our study group. So it's a lecture, but he's if you have any questions, if you have any doubts, please don't feel afraid to raise your hand or ask. Okay. You all know Luis. He's been part of our group for almost a year now. So with no further introductions, it's with you, Luis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is a two-part journey. We are beginning this month and we'll continue next month. Hi, Carol. And I mean, we are together, okay? So if you want to interrupt me and ask questions, feel free to. If you want to ask questions in the end, feel free to as well. I mean, we are here together. It's a normal Sunday. Let me share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully it's there. Today, we will talk about instinct and intelligence. As we usually do in our advanced classes, this is not chicken soup, okay, guys? This is steak. You guys will have to cut it and bite it and chew it. You are not going to receive, things ready to eat. It's gonna require your analysis, your thoughts, and your opinions. The codification tells us, and I'll have to partially read the slides because we have people connected who do not have image, so bear with me, please. And just reminding you that whenever you see things in italic and quotes, it's word for word of the source, and I always place a reference in my slide, so you can go and check. Not always the translation will be the exact version that you use, but that's life. But I try my best. Also, I usually do something like this, that is, I show you the text. So in Zoom, you don't see it. Oh, well.
Yes, we do.
Are you seeing the
We are seeing it.
Part of a book, Intelligence?
Yes.
There's something funny in my...
Yeah, but we can see it.
Just one second. Let me figure out what is going on. This has never happened. Anyway, there's a full chapter called Intelligence and Instinct in the Spirit's book. It's a short chapter, but you'll find reference there. And one of the first things that I start with is that intelligence is a special faculty by certain classes of organisms. So let's go on with the presentation itself. And that gives them the will to act, the awareness of their own existence and their individuality, as well as the means to establish relations with the outside world and to provide for their needs. That's Kardec's remark, his first remark on intelligence, a special faculty proper to a few classes of organic beings. Intelligence, oops, I was too fast. Back. Intelligence is not an attribute of the vital principle. Actually, this is a question that I have been asked many times in beginnings courses of Spiritism. The vital principle gives vitality. Plants live and they do not think. They only have organic life. Intelligence and matter are independent of each other. A body may live, yet lack intelligence. Only the union with the spirit endows animalized matter with intelligence. That is word for word in the Spirit's book, question 71. Continuing in the codification. To make things clear, they tell us, we can distinguish as follows. We have inanimate beings constituted solely of matter, without vitality or intelligence. They are the brute bodies. We have animate, non-thinking beings formed of matter and endowed with vitality, but not intelligence. And we have the animate beings formed of matter, endowed with vitality, and that have yet another intelligent principle that gives them the faculty of thinking. So, thinking, intelligence, according to the codification, comes from the intelligent principle. What is instinct then? So let's begin with instinct. On questions 73 and 75, the spirits of the codification affirmed to us that instinct is a type of intelligence, a non-reasoning intelligence that is always present. Non-reasoning, that seems to be the defining word. Just like this picture on the left, probably I could characterize the love, the affinity of a mother for his recent born child as non-reasoning, something that is just there. Continuing in the Spirit's book, instinct differs from intelligence because its manifestations are almost always spontaneous, while the manifestations of intelligence are the result of thought and deliberate act. Instinct manifests in various ways according to the different species and their needs. Just like the lioness there carrying her offspring in her mouth without hurting it. That's instinct. In beings that have consciousness and the perception of external things, I believe they mean us, instinct allies itself with intelligence. That is, instinct allies itself with will and freedom. Let's see the philosophical point of view of instinct. Instinct, from the Latin instinctus, is considered by philosophy a natural guide of animal and human conduct, which is not acquired, not chosen, and is little modifiable. That's what philosophers think. By the way, you've watched other I hate the word lectures, presentations of mine, where I defined, I believe, philosophy and other concepts. So if you need something regarding that, interrupt me. So according to philosophy, instinct is an inner impulse that allows the being to act unconsciously, performing acts considered adequate to the survival needs of one's own, or of their offsprings, or of their species. This comes from our friend Nicola Alaiano, who wrote the Dicionário de Filosofia that I use in many places to get philosophy perspectives. Tendency is something a little different from instinct. So let's try to qualify it. Tendency is something that drives someone to follow a path. It's a synonymous with predisposition, inclination, propensity. This fellow on the left seems to have a propensity of being not very happy or not showing satisfaction with whatever is happening. That's a tendency. It's something innate, but depending on their circumstances, a tendency can be controlled by education. It is thus under the control of reason. Impulse is not tendency. I believe many of you have had in your life, and you bought things by impulse. You just saw something and said, I want that. Is a thoughtless and spontaneous action, sometimes a reaction, sometimes something we say, driven by emotion. But impulse can also be managed by education. We can learn to control our impulses. A person, to control its impulses, his or her impulses, needs self-control. Back to Nicola Avaiano, he tells us that instinct differs from tendency for its biological character. Instinct is intended for the conservation of the individual and the species. It is linked to a determined organic structure. He's still talking from the philosophical point of view. It is distinguished from impulse by its stable character. There are two fundamental conceptions of instinct. The metaphysical conception, very old, according to which instinct is the force that ensures agreement between animal behavior, such as of the cat on the left, and the order of the world. And the second conception would be the scientific conception, according to which instinct is something biological. Guys, I'm going to build this in layers, so keep your attention. Metaphysical studies. Let's begin with metaphysics. Their studies on instinct appear with the Stoics. I don't know if you guys remember, I mentioned the Stoics in a presentation in the past. It's a philosophical school from the old Greece, maybe 300 years before Christ. In some aspects, it is very interesting because it's a philosophy of personal ethics that, among other things, defend working together and treating others fairly and justly. This thing came to a different place. Let me try to. Oops. This is a challenge too. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to get on the good side of Zoom here that has his own opinions on where to place. Okay, you'll be there. I'm happy. Nicola Abaiano tells us that instinct is part of a providential order in the world, which all beings are destined to maintain, because instinct directs animal conduct. That's a very basic concept. It means that nature makes the animal take care of itself through instinct automatically and to preserve itself, contributing to maintain the order of the whole. Actually, the Stoic philosophy was very popular first in Greece, then in Rome, among the Romans. And Marco Tullio Cicero, I'm sure you've heard of him, a famous Roman philosopher, orator, writer, lawyer, and politician, stated that to preserve itself, to preserve its life and its body, every animal species by nature avoids everything that seems harmful, desires and tries to arrange everything that's necessary for life, such as food, shelter, and everything else. It's also common to all animal beings, the sexual instinct, with a view to procreation and a certain care for the offspring. It should be obvious to you guys that we are building up with animals, but the parallels should be made with us. How much do we act by instinct? What is instinct to us? How should we consider instinct in the decision-making that we have to become better persons, better spirits in our world, to our work towards improvement? Anyway, the metaphysical doctrine, according to it, instinct has the following characteristics. The laws of nature guarantee that the instincts have providential action, on the sense that instinct provides for the animals. Infallibility, according to the metaphysical doctrine, as a result, that the instinct would always be able to guarantee the animal's life and the survival of the species. We know that it's not true, but it's what they say. Immutability, which derives from the two previous characteristics, and which would result in the perfectibility of the instinct. Blindness, the instinct is independent of the animal's control. It acts blindly. Those are ideas from 2,000 years ago. And what would be the scientific point of view? And please bear with me, because much of what I'm going to present you, we will use later. And also it's a chance to share with you some concepts that might not be, let me change the place of this, absolutely clear to you all. James Goodwin, in his book, A History of Modern Psychology, share with us regarding instinct that existing studies are complex and extensive, and there is still no scientific consensus on instinct. Meaning, they don't know what it is. In a few words, it's not a theme of a single meaning. On the contrary, it's a new idea completing an existing one. This has been a subject of study for many years, including by Robert Winston, a well-known British scientist, who says, Darwin was right in saying that none of the qualities associated with the term instinct are universal. There are always exceptions. But this is Robert Winston saying in his book, Human Instinct. We need a definition for instinct. And according to Winston, it lies in the difference between the mind we are born with and the mind we form with learning, culture, and socialization. So, according to Robert Winston, instinct is essentially the part of our behavior that is not the result of learning. I believe we spiritists must understand that it's not that the part of our behavior that's not the result of the learning through a number of reincarnations. or maybe not the direct result, because it might change indirectly. And this is something we'll see further on. However, our environment and therefore our learning can have a powerful influence on the way our instincts are expressed. Meaning, although we have instincts that we were born with, our environment and our learning can change substantially how we express those things, either for better or for worse. Psychology, sorry for the P, defines instinct as a permanent tendency or disposition to act in a biologically determined manner, characteristic of a particular species. So instinct or instinctive behavior is species dependent, according to psychology. And this is easy for us to verify. And this comes from Álvaro Cabral and Eva Nick. They are two Brazilian authors that wrote a technical dictionary of psychology. And they go on. The instinctive act is the product, considering animal behavior, including man as animal, of specific conditions, resulting from heredity, the environment, and also from adaptation, frustration, conflict, escape, impulses, circumstances. That's psychology definition, current psychology definition. Actually, science today has many points of view on instinct. And I've chosen to present you with two, because those two are very convenient for our Spiritist discussion. We're going to share with you the explanatory theory of instinct and the descriptive theory of instinct. Those two theories, by the way, are very lame, but they are interesting. The explanatory theory is essentially this. It explains. It notices that we can, shelve instinct manifestations in three shelves. And so we have shelf 1, reflex action, shelf 2, intellect, shelf 3, feeling. But it helps us to see the different aspects on how instinct manifests, and maybe help us recognize it in ourselves. So, the first shelf of the explanatory theory of instinct is the reflex action. We are used to see the reflex action as that thing on the left when we get a small interference, if I may say, in our knee, and the leg goes up without us doing anything. So a reflex action to instinct would be just that, something that happens in principle without us conscientiously wanting it to happen. This approach was originally brought to us by René Descartes. By the way, a parenthesis here. I am preparing a material for another advanced class in matter. I was talking to João about this a few moments ago, and it's wonderful. If he invites me to present it in English to you, I'll do that, because I'm bringing in the second part the state of the art of modern physical theory, quantum fields, and the concepts that the universe is not made of particles. But anyway, if he invites me, I'll present it to you. But when preparing that class, I began citing two guys that were burned on fire by the Catholic Church during the, oh, I forgot the word in English. Anyway, I don't know how Descartes was not burned in a fire, but if he was born like 100 years earlier, he would probably be gone. Anyway, Descartes told us that the human body works like a machine. Can you imagine he's saying this to the Catholic Church? Driven by reflex action. We just react. Bah, bah, bah. And interestingly enough, this concept gaining a lot of strength, even reaching the 20th century. This theory obviously was very questioned by a lot of people, including a guy named Robert Witt. Robert Witt wrote a book called The Vital and Other Involuntary Motions of Animals in 1750. And he did an important contribution, differentiating voluntary acts from involuntary acts. This was after years of research in the role of the spinal cord in mediating reflex actions. Because when the guy hits our knee and our leg moves, it's not our brain working. This all happens, like the image on the left shows, in our spinal cord. It's just too fast for the brain to notice. It's like when we touch something hot, our hand moves back even before we feel the heat, and we tell the brain to get our arm away from that. And he was able to clearly characterize that voluntary acts are controlled by the will, originated in the brain. And voluntary acts require the brain to be intact and working, while involuntary acts were controlled by the spinal cord and did not require the brain to be working. That's a very interesting development for the 1700s. And this was, we're talking 100 years before Kardec wrote the Spirits book. From the Taber's Psychoplegic medical dictionary, we have the definition that reflex action is the involuntary response to a stimulus, just as we mentioned. Reflex action is not controlled by the nervous central system, but by the nervous medulla and by the bulb that's here somewhere. We'll see. Reflex action characterizes unconscious act, whose results are specific and predictable, because in the course of evolution, they have become automated. Things like coughing, salivation, vomiting, blinking, pupillary movements would be, among others, examples of reflex acts. So, when the explanatory theory of instinct gives an explanation like reflex action to a particular instinct, they're trying to tell us that those actions that we shelve in this particular place, they are reflex, they are absolutely automated. Funny thing is, and one of the things that I'm presenting is, halfway between voluntary and involuntary controls, there is something that's called the formation of habits. This is according to James Goodwin again, A History of Modern Psychology. According to him, acts that begin as voluntary, under control of the will, might become similar to reflexes after a lot of practice. So, Our brain, after training, may have reflex responses that are similar to those that our spinal cord provide us, without the influence of our conscious thought, of our will. All this to present this guy that I'm pretty sure you've heard of, the famous Pavlov. Spencer, Darwin defend that theory. But this guy, Pavlov, and this is came just after Kardec. He developed a theory called conditional reflex theory that was very popular some time ago. On the perspective of training us humans to have conditioned reflexes that would be similar to reflex actions, would become instincts, would become trained instincts. And it's like this picture on the left. If you show a dog food, let's say the steak we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation, just looking at the steak, his body will start to salivate. Some of us, have the same thing. If I look at a nice, beautiful, whatever food, you begin to salivate. And this is very explicit on dogs. Then Pavlov started to show the steak and to ring a bell, and show the steak and ring a bell, and show the steak and ring a bell at the same time. He trained the dog in such a way that after some time, even without the steak, if he rang the bell, the dog salivated. I wonder if sometimes we do not behave the same way. Anyway, it's interesting to know that this is something that is there and we should be aware of. Intellect, that's the second shelf. You guys on the northern hemisphere, you see that a lot of the migrating birds that fly in flocks to the south, I believe right by this time of the year. That's instinct. And definitely that is not reflex action or a Pavlov trained habit. They had to find a shelf, and this shelf is called the intellect aspect of the theory of the instinct. It refers to more complex or more elaborate instinctive manifestation. You could say that the mother duck taught the young duck to fly and migrate, but you hardly could say that the mother salmon taught the baby salmon to swim back upriver to the place where he was born to lay his eggs. So it's a kind of automated intelligence of learning originated from an acquired habit formed and performed by the animal or by the species over time. So it's automated behavior formed over time in a particular species. This approach is taught by something called evolutionary psychology school. It probably began in Cambridge in about 1850. And this is a parenthesis slide. It's interesting because one of the guys who contributed to this particular school was a British guy called Douglas Spalding, whose probably most remembered contribution was that he was the preceptor, the private professor of someone who was very influential in the next century, Bertrand Russo. Bertrand Arthur William Russo, the third Earl of Russo, a guy I have already mentioned. He was a very, very important logician. He probably laid the ground for what von Neumann did later. First, Boole and von Neumann, not first, but Boole and von Neumann, or von Neumann's alone, in the construction of the digital computer. So this is an important guy. And we can understand that perfection through generations for something like this bird. Why does this bird build his nest in such a way? We have a species or a kind of bird here, it's not a species, called João de Barro, would be Mud John, who actually builds a nest, a closed nest with a single door made out of mud. It's an automated behavior by instinct, built along the ages, with learning by the species itself. And this is one of the key contributions of Spalding, according to James Goodwin. He was able to clearly characterize that instinctual acts, a number of those are specific to a single species. We don't see birds swimming upstream to lay their eggs like salmon. And there's the third part of the explanatory theory of instinct. That's the feeling or sympathy shelf. I have just one slide for it. This came up by Henri Bergson, a French philosopher, and essentially he said, there are instincts that are based on thoughtless sympathies and antipathies that we feel in ourselves. Something that's not the result of intelligence. Why does this girl or this woman hugs her white Labrador like that? That's not a result of thought. She didn't think, I'm gonna hug it. It just felt like hugging it. And it was a sympathy for this. It's not only extended to dogs, but it could be to things or to humans. My hands don't show always. Anyway. So that was the explanatory theory of instinct. I thought it was interesting to share with you so that you could see the different manifestations of instinct and do parallels in your mind on, do I behave like that? Do I show instinctive reactions like that? So that you can be aware of them. Oh, well. This is the descriptive theory of instinct. This theory is essentially a mixture of Freudian ideas, social psychology, Gestaltism, humanist psychology, part of educational approaches. And let's share part of this with you. The help here is going to be to build knowledge. I want you guys to have some concepts, some basic concepts that probably would have helped the ones who watched yesterday presentation by Kirsten on the USSF. We are going to talk about ego, id, superego. Let's try to take the mystification out of those concepts. You probably heard of this guy, Freud. Freud was an Austrian psychologist, actually an Austrian neurologist physician who is considered the father of psychoanalysis. Freud came up with a structural division of the human personality. This is a division of the personality, although it's applied to slightly different structures. And he's the guy who created this thing called the id, the ego, and the superego. He said, well, the human personality has three parts that interact and it results on what we present to the world. The id is an unconscious part, completely unconscious part of our personality. It represents the primitive thought processes, especially sex and aggression. Like when the kid on the other side is just want to do something very aggressive. The id requires constant satisfaction of their needs. It's something that comes from inside and needs to be satisfied. The id, according to Freud, constitutes the reservoir of Trieb. I'm not a good German speaker, so put up with me. Trieb, that means drive, a German word meaning instinct. For Freud, instincts influence the individual's conscious actions according to the degree of interference that the instinct gives to the person, according to the environment that person lives in, and the conditions of life that would be the education this person has received. And I would say along multiple reincarnations, but that's me saying, not James Goodwin. The ego that Kirsten, was not very fond of. The ego is a part of us that's partially conscious, partially unconscious. And it's the important connecting element between the id and the superego. And what is to say of the superego? Superego is the part of the personality that acts against instinctive manifestations of the id. The superego represents the moral and ethical thoughts. In particular, the moral and ethical thoughts that we have absorbed, possibly through education. And I would say, as a spiritist, not James Goodwin saying, along multiple reincarnations. So as we come back and back, in my opinion, this is your speaker saying, we internalize moral and ethical thoughts, and this lives in our superego. And this is an image to remember if you can. It's funny, my mouse does not show in your
yes, it does.
Screen. It does? Okay, good.
Yes.
Good, thank you. We as humans do not show 100% of what we are. Part of it is, it's like an iceberg. Part of it's shown, but the larger part is hidden. This is all Freud, okay? All Freudian ideas. So the id, our unconscious mind, our instinctive part, is always hidden. What is shown, what we show to the world is our ego. Not as a bad thing, it's our ego. And the ego is always interacting with the superego that's mostly hidden as well, and with the id, trying to get a compromise. And I'm gonna read part of what's written on the right so that people who do not have an image. So those are words from James Goodwin again, from A History of Modern Psychology. According to Freud, the individual actions are determined by the instinctive needs of the unconscious that has been developed by learning over the ages, behaviors, actions, needs for survival, aggressive postures. A healthy ego provides the ability to a human to adapt to reality and interact with the outside world as it is presented. True intelligence in a way that it's always, sort of compromising the id and the superego, the instinct and the ethical, moral, observed concepts in a way that's susceptible and allows the person to move in life, in incarnated life, if I say. So it's a very interesting concept. Ego is not bad. We used to joke in Brazil that the synonym of an Argentina was ego, because they are very self-centered. But ego is not a synonym of self-centering. It's a synonym of the intermediate between your atavic, your instinctive behavior, what you want to do instinctively, and what your moral and ethics tell you to do. We are getting closer to Spiritism here. But the descriptive theory of instinct has some very radical parts in its composition. One of them is the social instinct theory, very basic. It came from studies of a guy named William McDougall, and it radically says that instinct is the basis of all human activity, and mental operations are only instruments for the execution of impulses created by instinct. We are merely instinct reacting machines. According to McDougall, and he actually made a list of primary instinct and their emotions, we humans are only moved by our reactions, instinctive reactions to our emotions. So we are a composition of, when we feel fear, we flight. When we feel wonder, we are curious. Where we feel anger, we fight, and so on. Obviously, that's very basic, and it's not an idea that merits a lot of thought, but it's part of the what's the word in English? The Philip, when you make a blanket of small pieces, you call that a
patchwork quilt.
A quilt, okay. It's part of the quilt. One of the patches of the quilt. Then we get to Gestalt. Gestalt goes totally against, and many of you probably do not know what is Gestalt. So let's waste 2 minutes with that. Totally against this theory of reflexes from behaviorism. Gestalt is a school of thought. João, you just sent me a photo. Should I open it?
Oh.
Okay. Gestalt tells us that we cannot study behavior without being attentive to perception. Gestalt is all about perception. And regarding your reaction will be based on what you perceive. As an example, you have a picture on your left that shows either a guy looking at you or a guy looking, it either face in front of you or face toward the side of you. Depending on what you see, on the moment you watch it, your reaction will be different. And that's basically the point of Gestalt. So regarding instinct, Gestalt tells us that we will act instinctively according to what we perceive. It's not an automatic reflection. That's an interesting thing. I'm sure you guys have recognized in yourselves some behaviors that were results of perceptions that changed later because your perception changed. For Gestaltism, and allow me to again recur to Nicola Bagnano, instinct is a psychobiophysical disposition dependent on heredity. It might be formed soon after birth or sometimes after a certain period of development, which guides the animal, including the human animal, to pay special attention to objects of a certain kind or in a certain way, and to feel an impulse after perceiving those objects to act. Just like this little cat that's playing with this ball. And if you guys ever gave a little ball to a cat, you have seen what happens. For some reason, they perceive the ball as something interesting and they go and check it out, play with it. I could have thrown away this slide, but I wanted to show this image on the left. So again, bear with me. There were famous Gestalt psychologists like Kafka, Kohler, and Wertheimer developed something called Gestalt Laws, and people still talk about Gestalt today. It probably was more popular like 30 years ago, but or 40 years ago. But it is still something that's taught about, and there are Gestalt-based schools that teach children based on this philosophical line. So I wonder, you can see either a good-looking lady or a guy playing saxophone on this image to the left. So I wonder if you guys prefer the woman or the saxophone player. But it's neat, isn't it? It tells us how our perception can change the way we react. And this is pretty serious. Humanistic psychology, it's much more interesting. It assumes that human beings have free will. Hey, those guys are not spiritists, okay? This is taught to us by Álvaro Cabral and Eva Nick again in their technical dictionary of psychology. Human beings have free will and are not bound by determinisms imposed exclusively by genetic inheritance or environmental adaptations. They tell us that main representatives were Maslow. I'm sure you all guys heard of Maslow and the famous Maslow pyramid that places our needs in levels, survival, etc. Murphy, Bugentown, Buehler, Goldstein. For the humanistic psychology, again, Álvaro Cabral and Eva Nick tells us that the complete description of what it means to be alive as a human being must necessarily include the inventory of one's innate endowment, its potential. I don't know if a human is a he or is a it. Anyway, its potential, I translated this, its potential for feeling, thinking, and acting. This particular, I think one's potential would be the better English. One's potential for feeling, thinking, and acting. One's growth, evolution, and decline. And one's interaction with various environment and conditions. Now I know that this is it refers to description, so it's it. Anyway, and the full range of experiences that are possible for oneself and his meaning, the meaning of this one in the universe. We are getting closer to Spiritism. Johnny is breathing better now. Joanna de Angelis alerts us regarding all those psychological views that we have just reviewed. This comes from The Conscious Being, first part, chapter 4. Actually, Kirsten yesterday analyzed a different part of the same book. And Joanna De Angelis tells us that, or alerts us that, the old psychological models, due to narrowness of vision, did not encompass the current achievements that provide a broader understanding of the human personality, the unconscious, the deep self. Moving to intelligence, and I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation on instinct. What is intelligence? What a difficult thing to conceptualize. So I went to the Wall Street Journal. Jokes apart, in 1994, when there was a lot of discussion on intelligence, 52 scientists wrote a statement that was published, and this on the right here is the image of the publication, was actually published on the Wall Street Journal on December 13, 1994. This is a reproduction. It's the same text, but it's part of a paper by Linda Gottfriedson. And I highlighted the parts here that I'm gonna show you because it's easier to read, just for that reason. And what those guys say about intelligence or regarding intelligence, they tell us that intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, to plan, to solve problems, to think abstractly, to comprehend complex ideas, to learn quickly, and to learn from experience. And they go on. The concept of intelligence reflects a broader, deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, for catching on, making sense of things, figuring out what to do. Essentially, what they are saying is that intelligence is not the ability to complete a test, to become very rich, or to, say nice things. Intelligence is something else. Intelligence needs material implements, especially those of the nervous system, to express itself. However, Spiritism tells us that one should not confuse brain function with intelligence. According to Spiritism, intelligence is an attribute of the spirit. And here, I'm going to do a parenthesis that probably will make Paco fall from his chair, but well. Spiritism advises that regardless of how philosophy and science analyze intelligence and instinct, one must never forget that the mechanism that determine the evolution of instinct and intelligence mechanisms are mediated by the perispirit, the vehicle that shapes the physical body of man and of animals. Perispirit, the vehicle that shapes the physical body of man and animals. Remember, we do not look like our perispirit. Our perispirit does not look like us. We look like our perispirit. In the Genesis, and here begins the parenthesis, Kardec tells us that the perispirit, which has certain properties of matter, unites molecule by molecule with the body. And remember, the concepts of molecule, atoms, and cells was not very clear at the time. Well, I have a question. Does our perispirit has a brain? Does my perispirit has a brain? Actually, this is something that has intrigued me for a long time. I have asked in a couple of USSF's presentations to the speaker, I believe for his spent, but probably he thought I was a barbarian or of some kind anyway. It's the exact same question, and I never had a good answer. I don't know if you guys have an opinion, but I have formed an opinion. I'm gonna share with you how I formed an opinion. It began with this statement in the Genesis. If our perispirit unites molecule by molecule with the body, it's very reasonable to assume that we have organs in our perispirit. Or let's say differently, while incarnated, our three-dimensional body has extensions in other dimensions, and those are the perispirit. Nothing funny about it. But it would be an interesting question. Is this true regarding our brain? Does our brain extend itself in the perispirit? Philip is considering the question.
Why not?
André Luiz is a guy I trust. Not everything I read in a Spiritist book, I in turn 100%. But he's a guy I trust. I like the way he explains things. A lot of adjectives, but I think he's very fair when he relates what he has seen. And he tells us interesting things in a greater world that you guys have studied. So you guys should know all this, and you guys should all be able to answer my question if the perispirit has a brain. Funny thing is, I had read this book many times. I didn't notice those things. Only later, when studying for the first class on the subject, that, it popped up. So this is how important it is to do study together. Anyway, just so you remember, because you studied it, you remember the circumstance. André Luiz is with Calderaro. Remember Calderaro? Calderaro is an assistant of Eusebius. And in this particular point of the book, Calderaro, who had been providing active service in the very crust of the earth, attending directly incarnated brothers, took André Luiz with him. And they went to a hospital, and tells us André Luiz. Within minutes, accompanying Calderaro, I entered a vast hospital, and we stopped in front of the bed of a certain patient that Calderaro had to help at the time. Skipping part of it, the patient, although almost immobile, showed a strong nervous tension. Without noticing, with his physical eyes, the presence of his sinister-looking companion, a discarnated obsessor, the note is mine. Continues André Luiz. They seemed viscerally joined to each other. Thoughts from one of them would surely live in the other's brain. Then, or later, Calderaro asks André Luiz, examine the brain of our incarnated brother. Ba, 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 ba. Calderaro continues. You have examined the brain of the fellow who is still attached to the dense vehicle, the incarnated guy. No big deal there. André Luiz examined the brain of the incarnated guy. And Calderaro asks André Luiz, now observe the same organ, the brain, in the discarnated friend that is directly influencing him. Oh boy. The discarnated guy must have a brain so that André Luiz can examine it. And I go on. André Luiz speaking. After a few moments, I concluded that apart from the configuration of the pieces and the vibratory rhythm, I had under my eyes two almost identical brains. However, I asked myself, would the brain of a disincarnated person also be susceptible to illness? Brain of a discarnated person. Calderaro speaks later. Here we examine two patients. Both bring their brain intoxicated. So both have brains, the incarnated and the discarnated. He agrees with André Luiz. Oh my. Continues Calderaro. We are in front of the perispiritual organ of the human being, attached to the physical duplicate, in the same way that some parts of the carnal body have close contact with the clothing. And if that's enough, not enough for you, later on Calderaro says, the primitive human presents a perispiritual brain, with different vibrations from those of the organ in a civilized human. So André Luiz and Calderaro tells me, to my satisfaction, agreeing with my personal opinion, that the perispirit has a brain. Our perispirit has a brain. Or if I say differently, while incarnated, our physical body has an organ called brain, whose dimension, whose envelope includes the perispirit. And that makes so much sense to me. I would love that Jussara were there. You should tell João that Jussara should be here to argue this point. And I couldn't. Did you understand? I hope you did. I hope you agree or disagree, but at least we reviewed something together. João's face is not good for some reason. Anyway, let's talk about the human brain. In 1950s, a guy called Paul MacLean brought us his a theory that the brain would consist of three parts. This is why it's called a triune brain. In Portuguese, the word is slightly different, but anyway. Oh, these phones are good, but they hurt your ears. He's called his theory triune brain, and he believed that when we evolved from amphibians to terrestrial mammals and then to primates, our brains increased. Actually, they changed in characteristic. And if we see this picture on the left, his thesis is essentially that we have a primitive brain that's here in brown, that would be the reptilian brain. And we have a more evolved brain called the limbic system, that's shown here roughly in red. And then we have the neocortex, that is our advanced reasoning brain, usually that we associate with the image of a brain with all those things on the top of it. This increase in brain size occurred more in terms of quality than in quantity, MacLean tells us. This comes from Robert Winston from the book Human Instinct. What MacLean meant is that the changes in the brain were not due to a complete restructuring and reorganization. It was not like a revolution or like tearing the old house down and building a new one. Our brain changed rather in a way of developing extensions to the old inner core. Improvements, like we had a house and we extended and we extended and we extended and it became a castle. The triune brain would have then the three parts. The reptilian, also called primitive, the limbic that we mentioned, also called intermediate, and the neocortex, also called rational. Then the reptilian would be the primitive, the part of the brain that worries about survival, instinct. The limbic brain, also known as the emotional brain, here in this figure is called mammal, where there's emotion, pleasure, pain, and the rational brain, the neocortex, that will be responsible for not only logic, but thinking as a whole. First came the so-called reptilian brain. That's actually present in all reptiles. It's called reptilian. Responsible for functions that are basic, like breathing, blood circulation, digestion, and some very basic aspect of behavior. Is the brain on a crocodile, on a serpent. In humans, the reptilian brain is above the spinal cord, maybe here and here, the bulb and the cerebellum, the old brain in this particular picture. The limbic brain was developed with the evolution of the species, and where the emotions are located. Feelings like love, sadness, and jealousy seem to be rooted in the limbic brain. It's believed that the limbic brain controls most of our instincts. It has a lot of structures that are related to hormones, that are relating to feeding, perception of pleasure. Many of those you've heard about, the thalamus, the amygdalas, the hippocampus. And we have the neocortex. It's in the neocortic brain with evolution that we were able to have what we call continuous thought and logic reasoning that favored in humans the development of speech, writing, our ability to plan. André Luiz, in A Greater World, tells us that the brain is the sacred organ of manifestation of the mind. In the same book, I believe it's Calderaro, yes, it's Calderaro that say that we cannot have three brains simultaneously. What we have is just, sorry about that, is just one brain divided in three distinct regions. Continues Calderaro. Let's understand the brain as if it were a three-story castle, just like the one on your left. In the first, we place the residence of our automatic impulses, symbolizing the living summary of the services performed. In the second, we locate the residence, the domicile of current achievements, where the noble qualities that we are building are raised and consolidate. And in the third, we have the house of superior notions, indicating the eminences that we must achieve. Does it remind you of id, ego, and superego? Calderaro is saying pretty much the same thing, and he's not Freudian. Anyway, if you guys are interested, this castle is the Adair Manor in Ireland and has been turned into a hotel, and you can actually stay in it if you're interested. I must say that the rates are ridiculous, but if that's for you, go ahead. Ridiculously high, I would say. Anyway, and Calderaro closed saying, in one of them live habit and automatism. In the other floor of the castle reside effort and will. And in the last one reside ideals and higher goals to be reached. I love when Spiritism converge to non-incarnated science. And hopefully this will happen more often and more often, or maybe incarnated science converges to Spiritism. But the important thing is that the two go traveling together and joining forces. There's a book, and this book is a Spiritist book, and I'm not sure if it has been translated. João, do you know if it has been translated? Not yet.
It has not. It has not.
He is shaking his head.
No, it has not been translated.
Okay. João, again, your face is half clear, half dark. So we do not take this against you. Anyway.
I'm in the lower zones.
No, your tendencies. No, please don't. Anyway, the Triune Brain is a Spiritist book written by Irvenia Prada that I believe has presented material to USSF regarding animals, I think.
Yeah, she has been at SGNY with she gave a lecture at SGNY with on the book on the animals like 10 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so you know her. Décio Iandoli and Sergio Lopes, and I believe one of them is a doctor, or Ivenia is a doctor. Oh well. Anyway,
they are all. Sergio Lopes is a psychiatrist. His wife is a psychologist. Décio Iandoli is a doctor. Yes.
An MD, right? Practicing doctor. And it's an interesting book with 3 parts, just so that you know that it exists, and eventually it might be translated. And just reproducing part of it's in there. They say that in this evolutionary process, in the process of evolution of humans, our mind has organized itself in the manner of a 3-story house, each story interacting with one of the 3 parts that structure our being. Thus, past, present, and future interact respectively with instincts and automatism, effort and will, and ideals and goals to be reached, coexisting in complicity both in our mental house and in the corresponding brain structures. And this last paragraph is very good on the way that our mental structure that resides in the spirit, and maybe it has a good model in the Freudian model, matches and coexists with the physical structure in the brain. The book, if you have a chance to read it, provides a very medicine-oriented vision, the way I presented a little bit, a psychological vision and a spiritist vision. And I'm sure you might enjoy if you have a chance and the time to read it. Intelligence as a faculty of the spirit is developed not only through intellectual acquisitions, but also by other means, such as intuition and varied perceptions, as well as by the ability to use instruments, tools of work, art, and ecstatics, for example, along our reincarnations. Intelligence is a faculty of the spirit, including instinct, is developed along our multiple reincarnations and honed. And I don't have the word in English, improved, if I'm repeating myself. According to the Spiritist doctrine, and now we're going to give an historical perception of the development of the human intelligence. This development was clearly delineated by the humanization of the intelligence principle. We know that the intelligence principle resides in humans and in certain animals, but only in humans it has become humanized. The doctrine tells us that this happened gradually over the millennia, and I will defend the thesis with you that it has happened over millions of years. And as you know, with the help from spirits that came from different planets. Along with the conquests of intelligence, the human got free will, the condition that transforms humans into the builders of their own destiny. From the earliest times, human intelligence has been broadening by the acquisitions obtained in the innumerable reincarnations of the spirit and in its stages on the spiritual plane. So, not only the reincarnations, but our periods in the spiritual plane have helped us develop human intelligence and human instinct. This, by the way, is almost word by word, comes almost word by word from Brazilian Spiritist Federation material in their advanced studies. Leon Denis, in his book, The Problem of Life and Destiny, tells us the same, but let's hear his words. For the Spiritist doctrine, human intelligence began to be perceived in the hominids, a condition acquired after a long journey of the intelligence principle in the lower realms of nature during the course of ages in both planes of life. Leon Denis tells us that the construction of intelligence was slow and laborious, beginning from the moment the intelligence principle united with the material principle. And due to time limitations, this is where I will stop. And I will get back to you next month, exactly in this slide, where we will talk a little about the evolution of primitive humans. We'll hear from anthropology. We'll check Spiritist concepts. We'll get back to the Genesis, and we'll talk about lots of interesting things, but this is just a sneak preview of what we will see in our next journey together.